Olá, meu nome é Lívia, eu sou acadêmica do primeiro semestre de Engenharia e Produção Mecânica e hoje eu vou falar um pouquinho sobre a aplicação da pesquisa operacional na área de logística. Primeiramente, eu gostaria de iniciar com o seguinte questionamento. Você sabe como as suas compras online são entregues? Bem, não se desespere se você não souber como responder essa pergunta, porque ao longo da minha apresentação eu vou explicar um pouquinho sobre os processos que ocorrem para que uma compra que você faz pelo seu próprio celular chegue à porta da sua casa. Não é um processo muito fácil, vamos falar a verdade, porque existem várias pequenas coisas que as empresas devem se atentar. Mas vamos começar aqui falando um pouquinho sobre logística, os conceitos básicos de logística. Bem, a logística, basicamente, ela é um campo de estudo que abrange as áreas de processamento, de armazenagem e também de distribuição, além de marketing. Existem várias áreas dentro da logística, mas inicialmente eu gostaria de falar essas para que seja mais fácil que vocês entendam, certo? Quais são as suas origens? Bem, o termo logística, ele remete à Segunda Guerra Mundial, porque havia necessidade de deslocar tropas, mantimentos, enfim, diversas coisas dentro do campo de batalha. E a organização era primordial para que tudo isso funcionasse muito bem. Apesar desse termo ter surgido ali durante a Segunda Guerra Mundial, a aplicação propriamente dita da logística, ela já era feita muito tempo antes pelo rei da Macedônia, Alexandre o Grande, por volta de 325 a.C. Ele era uma pessoa muito organizada e desde sempre ele se destacou nesse campo militar e ele estudava muitas coisas antes dele ir para o campo de batalha com as suas tropas. E isso fez com que ele realmente se destacasse ali na área e ele se tornou basicamente um grande conquistador, um dos maiores conquistadores da história. E falar um pouquinho sobre as suas conquistas com o seguinte vídeo. Só um segundinho para colocar. Como que ele se organizava, né? A gente fala muito sobre as conquistas, mas não fala como que ele conseguia realmente.
An army's logistics system has always been crucial to its success, and Alexander's army was no different. Skillful organization of his forces throughout his campaigns. So, in this episode, we shall cover the logistics of the Macedonian army. Our story starts with the logistics of the Greek armies of the classical period. When fighting fellow city-states, the armies usually followed certain conventions. They would leave their home city and travel to an agreed battleground suitable for phalanx warfare. They would then engage their enemy in battle before returning home. The armies were not intended to stay out in the field for long durations. Thousands of non-combatants, attendants, women and slaves traveled with them, sometimes outnumbering the soldiers. That dramatically reduced the army's speed and mobility, and every follower meant an extra mouth to feed. Furthermore, the Greek armies used ox carts and wagons, and this inevitably impeded an army's speed and mobility further. The throat and girth harnesses severely damaged the animals, and rough terrain easily hindered the carts. This system was therefore designed only for short distances and slow movement. Philip realized that things needed to change, and made sweeping reforms to the Macedonian logistics system. He aimed to create a system that prioritized his army's sustainability and made use of a logistics system that had been radically transformed into the most efficient of its time. In 335 BC, for instance, to crush a Theban revolt, his army marched from Lake Lychnidus to Boeotia, some 500 miles, in 13 days, catching the Theban rebels completely off guard. With his newly reformed logistics system supporting and supplying his army, in 334 BC, Alexander set forth for Asia. Yet fighting in Asia would prove very different from fighting in Europe. Alexander therefore soon adapted the logistics system he had inherited to suit his new theatres of war. One such area that gradually experienced improvement and alteration was the baggage train. Traversing the Persian Empire meant that Alexander needed to ensure his baggage train was well organized. Therefore, a transport officer, a skoidos, was placed in overall charge of the baggage train. The skoidos would manage the baggage train's defences, marching order, the welfare of the pack animals, and distribution of supplies. Parmenion likely filled this role until his execution. Their wives and children again in Macedonia. Alexander therefore permitted women to travel with the baggage train again. Alexander even allowed his soldiers to marry captive women. They would have children, and the baggage train swelled in size. Although a radical change from his father's logistics system, troops, most notably food and water. Grain products were the major staples of a Macedonian soldier's diet. Wheat, barley, and millet, all were available throughout Asia and India. Not only were they easily portable, but once these products were dried, they could be stored indefinitely. From their ration, each soldier would use the grinding mills carried by the servants to create flour, and after that, make bread. It is also possible the Macedonians consumed grains in the form of biscuits and porridge. Yet the Macedonian soldiery did not live solely off grain products. Whenever possible, they would also eat dried meat, salted fish, and shellfish to supplement their diet. Meat, however, was rare, and more often the soldiers turned to various kinds of dried fruit, such as figs and dates, both readily available throughout much of Asia. Each Macedonian soldier would carry his food rations, discarded during these marches. Lands would have been extremely taxing for any Macedonian burdened with arms, armor, and a heavy pack. Indeed, it appears armor was sometimes even discarded during these marches. Consequently, the requirement for sufficient calories and water was critical. Scholars assume that a minimum of 3 pounds of grain products, the equivalent of nearly 1.5 kilograms of bread, as well as half a gallon of water, would be needed to supply each troop in these conditions daily, some 3,600 calories. Meanwhile, horses and mules needed 8 gallons of water and 10 pounds of both grain and straw a day if they were to be kept in good condition. As for a camel, although the animal could survive multiple days with barely any water, the animal was most efficient if the Macedonians gave it 10 gallons of water a day. It would also require 10 pounds of grain and 25 pounds of straw. Acquiring supplies would prove anything but easy. For most of his campaigning life, Alexander and his army traversed the various terrains of inland Asia, lands on many occasions hostile to him, and far away from seas and navigable rivers. This forced Alexander to acquire supplies via land. Transporting supplies over land was fraught with difficulty. There were few carts and pack animals available in many of these regions, and there was also the constant threat of banditry. Furthermore, most agricultural societies in the east did not have a surplus of food from which they could help supply Alexander's passing army. But Alexander evidently found a solution. Recently, a groundbreaking study by Donald Engels concluded how the Macedonian king most likely achieved this. Upon his arrival in Mesopotamia after victory at Gaugamela, Alexander's power and military prestige in the east became phenomenal, and soon many of the remaining Persian officials surrendered. Alexander realized he could solve his supply problem. He sent messengers ahead of his army to meet the officials to secure a range of the army's supply through their territory, sometimes taking hostages to ensure the officials kept their word. Thus, Alexander secured his supply lines far in advance. When officials did not surrender to Alexander, he took a different approach. He would acquire intelligence about the region, information such as its topography, routes, climate, and resources, and he would then either launch a lightning campaign against the region with a small elite force keeping the main army back, or he would split his forces into smaller units that would gain supplies by either sacking settlements or foraging. These more destructive methods regularly occurred in the Persian heartlands. During the winter months, Alexander ensured his forces remained in a heavily settled, usually adjacent to either navigable rivers or ports, from where supplies could be more easily obtained. Thanks to his forward planning and charisma, Alexander was able to find solutions to the lingering threat of supply problems throughout his.
Então, no vídeo, a gente conseguiu perceber que o Alencar, ele realmente foi uma das maiores figuras históricas que a gente pode comentar sobre a logística e que ele realmente revolucionou a forma de encontrar várias soluções para uns problemas que as tropas militares tinham. Agora, retomando o resto da apresentação. Eu não sei onde. Vamos falar sobre a questão de otimização da logística, né? É com a aplicação da pesquisa operacional que a gente consegue otimizar a logística, porque a gente consegue literalmente mapear as decisões que a gente poderia tomar e escolher a melhor decisão possível diante do cenário que a gente tem. Através das fases da pesquisa operacional que a gente consegue colocar isso na vida real, do papel da vida real. Então, a gente primeiro desenvolve o sistema real, a gente define o nosso problema, a construção do modelo matemático, depois a solução do modelo, a validação do modelo, a implementação dos resultados e a avaliação final. Assim, existem diversas áreas da pesquisa operacional, como processos decisórios, teoria dos jogos, programação linear, teoria das filas. Então, assim, existem várias áreas da PO que podem ser utilizadas na logística. A mais usada, entretanto, é a programação linear. Então, existe a definição do modelo para que haja a maximização dos lucros da empresa e a minimização dos custos que ela poderia ter ali. Então, é basicamente isso. E essas foram as minhas referências, tanto sobre artigos acadêmicos sobre pesquisa operacional aplicada à logística, como alguns artigos sobre a carteira dos produtos, lógico. Então, eu espero que você, ao final dessa aula, apresentação, saiba como que um produto que você compra online chega na sua casa, né, que é através justamente da logística e também da aplicação da PO com muitas empresas no campo de logística, através da logística e da aplicação dela, da utilização dela pela pesquisa operacional, que a gente tem a possibilidade de melhorar realmente os sistemas de transporte. Não só de transporte, como de marketing, armazenamento, estoque, muitas outras áreas. E é isso.